Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. What will 1927 be like in terms of bank robberies? Well, January 1927 will certainly set the tone, so we'll take a look at the pop culture, the general conditions, and general crime under culture, conditions, and crime. We'll kick off January 1927 like so many people do today for New Year's resolutions, and sometimes at their yearly horoscope. For that type of idea, we'll turn to the Tuesday, January 4, 1927 Milwaukee Leader. In it, there appears to be a regular column or a syndicated one. It's titled Findings, and it is written by Oscar Ameringer. He notes the following prophecies from his private horoscope and guarantees them. Of course, if a reader didn't find them satisfactory, he said that the predictions would be taken back with no questions asked or answered. Ameringer makes sarcastic, tongue-in-cheek predictions about Senator Frank Smith from Illinois, about an impending coal strike, that the weather would be the number one topic of discussion, followed closely by baseball. Then he notes that there would be a marked increase in bank deposits, but also bank robberies. And while a wisecrack, it demonstrates how commonplace bank robberies had become, or had been, I guess, in 1926, and had become to be expected in 1927. They were part of the culture. Interestingly, his final predictions noted that 4 out of 4 Russian revolutions would fail, and that disputes over American oil rights in Mexico would result in oil for America and essentially the shaft for Mexico. He concluded with a quip about Mussolini and predicted that Mussolini would either be assassinated, die a natural death, or just keep on living. Bold predictions. So in terms of pop culture, we see the idea of the bank heist to enter popular culture in written form, in newspaper serials, in magazines and books. We also see it acted out on stage and in moving pictures, also known as movies. The Bozeman Courier, Poplar Standard, and the Ronin Pioneer were 3 papers that ran a nearly full-page story by E. Phillips Oppenheim, and it was titled The Remarkable Astuteness of Police Constable Chopping. It sounds English, and that's because it was. The story was about a young man whose identity matched that of another man who'd robbed an English bank in a town, which may or may not be real, called Melhampton. And it is just another example of the ubiquity of bank robbery, is certainly in America, and we can see it's even outside of America. The Milwaukee Leader's previous edition, the January 3rd one, ran a different serial from an H.C. Whitwer, and it was titled Bill Grimm's Progress. The main character was a man named Bill Grimm, who was a taxi driver from Fairfax Falls, who's, quote, very well acquainted with Barbara Baxter, end quote, who was a federal agent. Grimm helped federal agent Baxter catch Jack Fairfax, a bootlegger. Then, for some unknown reason, Bill Grimm went on to defend Fairfax and even helped him with bail. Grimm then headed to New York, where he was implicated in a bank heist. Thankfully, Baxter, the federal agent, clears him, at which point Grimm becomes a stuntman in the movies. It's a very odd story. There's a nice rendering of Grimm going the extra mile to make the scene believable by driving the car off of a pier. It ended up landing him in the hospital. For our purposes, the fact that he was implicated in a bank heist and it wasn't a critical turning point of the story, it shows how regular the idea, again, of bank heists was. The Springfield Weekly Republican out of Springfield, Mass., ran a Thursday, January 20, 1927 edition, And they had a section called Plays and Players, which was a review of Broadway plays. Among them was a play titled Junk. The main character of Junk was a man named Ernest John, who was, quote, a fat philosopher, end quote, who helped people out everywhere he went. Well, he jumps off a freight train that he was, I assume, riding illegally, and ended up at a farm. So he helped out at the farm since the grandmother was dying. During the story, he falls in love with the young woman of the farm and then somehow ends up helping out in a bank robbery, but only because he was going to spread the wealth, at least his portion, I'm guessing, in within the farming community. The story goes on, and it is pretty convoluted and has lots of twists and turns. It's actually kind of interesting. But for our purposes, once again, the fact that a bank robbery is part of the story, but not the most critical focal point, is pivotal. Well, the Montgomery Advertiser had a Monday, January 10, 1927 edition in which they ran a regular section called The Movies. The particular story in this edition, at least, was really kind of interesting, and it tracked the history of movie making. It went back to 1824 and then moved forward with each major technological advance. They noted that the first three extensive efforts that included narration included the Great Train Robbery, which was the second extensive effort, and the Great Bank Robbery, which was the third. So we have examples of bank robberies in magazines, newspapers, on stage, and in the movies. We even have quirky newspaper editorials about horoscopes and predictions. It seems that bank heists were woven into the fabric, the consciousness of the American people. Well, the Montgomery Advertiser also has a letter to the editor section, as seen in the Tuesday, January 27th, 1927 edition. The editor was J.M. Stark, and he penned an impassioned and incredibly well-written letter from the editor, I guess it would be. Anyway, he discussed how the ongoing Scopes trial and anti-monkey bill were paramount for, in this case, Alabama, but by virtue of that, also the whole country. He noted how the day's youth were impressionable and were heading in a bad direction. Women were dressing like men. They'd shorn their long locks of hair to imitate men's short cropped haircuts. Modesty and shame, according to Stark, were out the window. Women had taken on even men's vices. We know that cigarette smoking became a thing for women. Drinking certainly did. And they were even committing highway robbery and perpetrating bank heists. Only 2 columns away, there was another editorial, and it was titled, "Bankers Want a Bombs Law for Every State." The editorial noted that the Protective Committee of the American Bankers Association favored a law similar to New York's Bombs Law. They proposed legislation with a mandatory 30-year minimum sentence, but no more than a 50-year maximum sentence for a robber who used a gun to rob people in general, in a business, in their residence, or in a bank. And luckily, the January 19, 1927 Indianapolis Times provides a real-life example of what the Bombs Law editorial was all about. The Indiana State Pardon Board was receiving arguments upon the paroling of an Arthur Silbert. Silbert had been serving a life term for murder and a bank robbery. Silbert's relatives appeared on his behalf, as you'd expect, but opposition was there as well, including the Bankers Association sent representatives, and also, really critically, the president and cashier of the Culver State Bank in Culver, Indiana. Silbert's defense contended, I guess, that he'd been lured into bank robbery by, quote, liquor and bad companionship, end quote, and that he had nothing to do with the shooting. It appeared that an unnamed police officer had been shot during the heist and had languished in a hospital, presumably, and died 33 days later. Mind-bogglingly, the article ended leaving the obvious question unanswered. Does he go free? Does he remain free? At least that question goes unanswered for now. Well, the January 13, 1927 Indianapolis Times shows us that the state of Indiana wanted to maintain control over their bank robbers. A Representative Salwasser in the Indiana House of Representatives introduced Bill HB 19, which defined the crime of bank robbery and set the maximum penalty as life imprisonment with a minimum of 10 years. So bank robbery wasn't just ensconced in the pop culture, but it was coming out through editorials, and it was in the political realm as well. An Associated Press story that ran in the New Britain Herald, the Brownsville Herald, and the Daily Alaska Empire from different dates in January discussed that citizens that were armed and organized into county ranger units in Minnesota were credited with reducing bank robberies in 1926 statewide to just one. In the previous year, in 1925, there had been 10, and the number kept increasing out until to 1921. Incidentally, that was the early December 1926 Rochester, Minnesota heist that we covered in the December 1926 Part 4 video titled Bank Robbery Babe versus Bank Robbery Brutes. And I've actually got a picture of the Bank Robbery Babe that we will see in the follow-up video that will be coming out after this one. Meanwhile, the Milwaukee Leader ran a January 3rd, 1927 story, and they noted that adequate protection was not devised by the Wisconsin Bankers Association, and that and predicted that there would be greater loss in 1927 than there was in the previous year. So it's really juxtaposed against the Minnesota story, action versus inaction, and those are the results. And speaking of Indiana, this is our first use of the South Bend News Times. It's kind of cool. It's January 5th edition, 1927. Emblazoned across the top was local bank employees practice with firearms in preparing to cope with attacks of hold-up men. Column 1 front page said, Rudinsky trains bank workers in use of firearms, and was subtitled further, employees will practice regularly in campaign to battle bandits. So they strategically use the word campaign, which we see in political battles and in wars. This was a war against what they called hold-up men. South Bend, Indiana's Sergeant Peter R. Rudinsky, who was a Marine, whose, quote, deadly aim frustrated one robbery 2 months ago and brought death to the robber, end quote. He was the one who was going to work with bank employees on a weekly basis. Previous to his run-in with the robbers and the shootout with the bank robbers, he'd been in a previous battle when he was a patrolman. He'd actually been shot, the bullet amazingly deflecting off his badge, and instead of hitting somewhere in the area of his heart, lodged in his shoulder, but not before he tapped the shooter twice, thereby killing him. So every evening at 5:15, some area bank employees and bankers went to a target range located where? In the attic of City Hall. That's where they were training. Strange location for a shooting range. Training was available to everyone, from the bank president down to the janitor and messenger boy, and Saturdays were set aside for anyone who was absent during the week. Violent bank heists were expected at this point, and it's only 1927. Bank robbery, the concept of it was on everyone's mind, in popular culture, in the political realm, actually in banks, in editorials. People were speaking and talking about robberies, and it's just heating up right now. We'll see that in an explosive January of 1927. Next up will be some follow-ups where we tie up loose ends on old friends from 1926, and then we move on to 1927. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of Heistery. Until next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye bye, blackbird.